when you began to learn about the atrocities that had been committed in Israel? What was your initial reaction?
My first reaction was disbelief, followed by utter horror at the abject nature of Hamas's terrorism. Hamas had been quite skillful up to that point in implying that what all they were doing was retaliating for excesses in their eyes of the Israeli Defense Force, and that they were the victims. But they went completely beyond the pale last Friday, Saturday. And if you go about just massacring completely innocent men, women, and children in the circumstances in which they did that, there's bound to be a reaction. I mean, there would be if this were in the UK. And bear in mind that Israel has only about 9 million people in it. So you're in a situation which is, I mean, it's a physically very small country as a whole of that area, the so-called Holy Land is. And it's a small population too. So everybody will know somebody who knows somebody else who was injured in these massacres, as well as the fact that the Israeli Defense Force is genuinely, as they say, people's army. They've all had to serve in the IDF in order to try to keep their country safe. So the Hamas has placed themselves beyond the pale, and there's bound to be a reaction. Now, I agree with James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, earlier today, saying it's really extremely important that Israel observes the rules of law of war in this situation, because what distinguishes civilized countries from this kind of abject terror is, amongst many other things, a rule of law, which certainly Hamas do not observe. But there are going to be, in this retaliation, I'm afraid, a lot of innocent Palestinians killed as well. And the problem is that on this occasion, much more clearly than any previous one I can think of, the authors of that misfortune, terrible misfortune for the Palestinians, will be their own so-called leadership, who are inhumane fanatics.
And, one of the things that, we're now moving towards in terms of the story developing and, absolutely unequivocal is the condemnation of Hamas and the absolute condolences of everybody affected by that in Israel. We've just interviewed a very brave young man whose girlfriend was taken hostage at the music festival last week. They haven't heard anything about her since then. So there's a huge amount of sympathy with the people of Israel. But of course, attention is now focusing on what happens next and what happens to innocent people in Palestine. And as you said, how can the rules of war, how can the rules of humanitarian law and, how can a response be proportionate? I mean, how can those lines be adhered to when emotions are so raw? And what are the unintended consequences of Israel going in a way which is disproportionate?
Well, I think what Hamas are banking on is that the Israelis will act with excess, and as a result of that they will lose the considerable public support and political support they've had around the world. I mean, Hamas don't give a fig for their population. I mean, there are all sorts of things they could and should have done in terms of cooperation with the Israelis, on whom I'm afraid they depend, as everybody now knows, for water and for electricity and plenty else. But one of the things they do is to embed their military operations within civilian buildings. And that, of course, makes it extremely difficult in terms of targeting for the Israelis. But given the rage of the Israelis and the huge public pressure on the Israeli government, which I certainly know, as it were, a friend of mine, and they've been very incompetent in all sorts of ways, as well as consumed with all sorts of agendas which have led them to take their eye off the ball. But given that there's the public pressure on them, they're going to try and go in hard to eliminate the Hamas leadership. And their argument will be, well, we've got no other option. Now, this is about caring for how civilized Palestinians and civilized Israelis are able to lead half-decent lives in the future. And for that reason, not out of any remote concern for this inhumane leadership of Hamas, that I hope very much that there are some wise counsels within the Israeli government, and particularly within the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, which is recognizing the need for restraint. That said, this is going to be bloody, and there will be innocent people killed. And what Hamas will carry on trying to do is to go in for this kind of moral equivalence and turn the whole story against Israel. But people need to remember not to be naive.
Yeah.
This was begun unprovoked by Hamas.
And look, William Hague wrote an interesting piece in the Times a few days ago saying that, there is a danger. Well, this whole thing is fraught with danger and violence and just awful things. But he said, look, this could be, a trap by Hamas, as you say, to elicit a very disproportionate response. Do you think behind the scenes, there's the front of house diplomacy where you have James Cleverly, you have America, you have the British Labour Party as well, very visibly standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel. But do you think in terms of the back channel diplomacy, there are conversations about restraint being had from allies to Israel?
I'm sure they are. Yeah, of course. And in a country facing this, this was the worst day of atrocity, certainly since the Yom Kippur War, and I think in practice since the formation of Israel in 1948, because I don't recall there being a similar loss of life during the Yom Kippur War, and certainly not during the Six-Day War, which was 6 years before that. So, of course, Hamas will be trying to turn it to provoke the Israelis. I think what's also very clear now, despite some bits of intelligence, part of which have been reported in the Haaretz Jerusalem newspaper, that some of the Hamas commanders on the ground were under orders to go in for this kind of massacre. I think it's pretty clear that the massacre was much, much worse because there were no IDF soldiers down guarding the kibbutzim in the south. They were preoccupied, as a number of leading Israelis have pointed out, in trying to guard the settlements, which Netanyahu's government have been illegally built on Palestinian land in the West Bank. But anyway, they will certainly be trying to provoke Israel, and it's incumbent. Very difficult for Israelis to do this, but I just hope there are wiser counsels within them that realise that they need to be strategic about the way they operate here. And
look, many people are calling this Israel's 9/11, and of course you were absolutely at the heart of government when 9/11 happened, those atrocities, and you better than anybody know that decisions taken in the heat and the emotion and the rawness of these terrorist attacks can have profound consequences. And when we look back at the sort of narrative since 9/11, there was so much sympathy and empathy towards America at the time, but many felt that goodwill was squandered in terms of the action that then happened. And of course, what we have seen after that was a cycle of violence and more terrorism and radicalization and many sort of security issues that arose out of that. Do you worry about what the long tail of this is going to be?
Yes, of course I do. If you go back to 9/11, I think I continue to believe, obviously I've recycled it a great deal, that we, the US, the UK, and many, many other allies, had no alternative but to go into Afghanistan, because it was from there that the 9/11 Al-Qaeda terrorists were operating. The Taliban government in Afghanistan was given an ultimatum to yield up the terrorists, and they would then have paradoxically been able to stay in power. But anyway, they refused to do so. What else could we do in that situation? We had to sort of clear Afghanistan of these terrorist camps, and there were a lot of them, as well as trying to provide some justice for probably a majority of Afghans who'd been completely disenfranchised.
Although, Jack, sorry to interrupt, here we are 20 years on. We've all left Afghanistan. Afghanistan is now run by the Taliban. Women are literally disappearing. I mean, many people look at that and say, gosh, was it worth it to get to this place now? And the Taliban are back in charge.
Well, we had to do it, whether it was worth it. I mean, you have to take these decisions at the time. And certainly sitting on our hands would never have worked. Now, there were a whole series of mistakes made, to which I was party when I was in office, about what kind of government we tried to encourage to grow, the fact that the Afghan forces weren't built up sufficiently, and so on. But I was going to say that, I mean, the bigger error that was made, and it was an error by me as well as by plenty of others, was in respect of Iraq, because as I've previously described it, whereas the war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity arising from 9/11, the war in Iraq was a war of choice. I thought it was the right thing to do at the time, but in retrospect, it wasn't. And that had plenty of consequences for instability within that part of the world. Ironically, Iraq is in these things are just relative. It's in a great deal better place, either than it was before under Saddam, and certainly much better than Afghanistan was then and is now.
Look, you spoke earlier about you hope that that behind the scenes the Israeli leadership is getting wise counsel from cooler heads about taking a more strategic approach to this. And I was looking back at, your time in the Foreign Office, and you at one point did suggest having or opening up some kind of dialogue with Hamas. And in fact, you felt that you were demoted because that Tony Blair demoted you because you did want to open up a dialogue. Talk to us about that. I mean, at some point, is there going to have to be some sort of, if there's any chance of peace, is there going to have to be some kind of dialogue with these people?
Well, I mean, the background to that was in 2005, early 2006. We, the West, the US and the UK in particular, had pressed the Palestinian Authority to hold elections. And we knew that it was highly probable that in Gaza, because the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority Party, was so corrupt and decrepit, it was highly probable that Hamas was going to win. Anyway, Hamas did win in Gaza, fair and square. There was no fair and square internationally accepted ballot. And my argument was, well, okay, we need to hold our nose about dealing with these people, but you can't have it both ways. We pressed them to hold these elections. We knew very well that Hamas were likely to come out on top, and we'd say we need to talk to them. But I mean, that was then, and that's I say 2006. That's a long time ago, 17 years ago. I mean, today you can't have, in the immediate term, you can't have negotiations with Hamas. However, that, to my certain knowledge, when I was around, and this was one of the ironies, I got criticised in Israel for saying we might need to have a conversation with Hamas. Israel was having conversations with Hamas every day through their intelligence channels. I mean, and when I said that to them, I used to just shrug, but it was true. And I'd be astonished if there weren't some means of communication with Hamas, not least through Hamas's political leadership in Qatar. Which, I mean, they have this political leadership outside the territory of Gaza. I mean, partly because these guys don't mind putting other people in the front
Oh,
line.
of course. I mean, while they live a life of luxury in
Yeah, but
Qatar.
it's also they will say, well, it's in order to maintain communication. So there are ways of getting through to the political leadership and the political leadership of Hamas, and we'll have to see what happens. But I mean, it's awful. But the fact that Hamas said to their people in Gaza, I mean, to the population in Gaza, don't follow what the Israelis are saying. It's all a feint by the Israelis. And by all accounts, about 1 million people in the North Gaza have now moved south. Shows that those people have voted with their feet, and there's I mean, certainly by no means a majority support for the Hamas leadership in Gaza.
Okay.
But like the Israelis.
Now, Jack, I'm just going to let you go in one moment. I'm just going to read a message one of our listeners has sent in. Mike has just been listening to this and has messaged and saying, in the current circumstances, I can't see how turning Gaza into rubble will actually help the situation. But that's not what I expect to happen, with very little pushback from those who have the ear of the Israeli government. And that's a failure of leadership. Final question to you, Jack. What's the future? Is there any chance of a two-state solution at any time in the foreseeable future?
Not in the. I mean, I agree with that, colleague, but I go back to say, what in these circumstances, what are the Israelis supposed to do? I mean, they cannot. They wouldn't survive politically if they would just say to Hamas, "Well, it's all right, fine. There you go. You've killed 1,200 of our people, innocent people, and so we're just sitting on our hands." The world isn't going to work that way, and Hamas knew that there'd be this kind of retaliation. On the two-state solution, that's, I'm afraid, parked for the moment, and it will stay parked. But there also need to be changes in the Fatah leadership in the West Bank, because Mahmoud Abbas, who's been the president of the Palestinian Authority, had a very distinguished career, but he is now well into his 80s. And you can say, well, I'm well into my 70s, but there comes a moment when you realise, and certainly I've realised that yes, you've got a role sort of commenting on what's going on and perhaps providing some wise counsel, but not being in the thick of it. And they need another generation of leaders in the West Bank. There could, over time, but I think that it's extremely improbable, be more benign circumstances, certainly if the Hamas leadership are really weakened as a result of this catastrophic adventure by the Hamas military leadership. There may be a possibility of a more moderate leadership in Gaza, but I'm not holding my breath for that.